When winter folds over a mountain valley, it hides more than roads and rooftops. It hides stories waiting to be found. On a night when the snow fell heavier than any memory, one police officer drove through the storm with a loyal German shepherd fighting for every breath. What happened next would test courage, faith, and the quiet miracles that only appear in the coldest hours. Before we begin this journey of hope and loyalty, tell me where you are watching from. I would love to see your hometown in the comments below. Winter had settled over Crescent Valley with the quiet certainty of a kingdom reclaiming its throne. The sky hung low and heavy, a wash of ash-gray clouds pressing against the jagged silhouette of pine-lined mountains. Wind swept along the empty highway, scattering ribbons of powder across the asphalt until the road felt less like a man-made path and more like a thin scar crossing an ancient, sleeping animal. The storm had not yet reached its full strength, but the air carried the whisper of the white wall waiting beyond the ridges. On this road, beneath the constant whisper of snow against the windshield, a police SUV crawled forward as if resisting the very season that surrounded it. Inside, Officer Elias Warner, 42, gripped the steering wheel with the quiet steadiness of a man who had lived far too long in places that demanded emotional silence. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture carved by years of duty belts, midnight calls, and winter patrols. His hair, once a dark chestnut, now carried thin streaks of silver around the temples, a premature frost that hinted at nights spent on mountain roads looking for people who never called for help until it was too late. Lines trails along his forehead and around his eyes suggested not age, but endurance, the soft erosion left by years of carrying more than anyone ever saw. Elias was known in Crescent Valley as a steady presence, respectful, kind in a quiet way, and impossible to rattle. But he also kept people at a distance, like someone who had learned through some old wound. The kind no one pried about that closeness came with a cost. The only exception to that rule lay in the back seat. There, curled beneath a wool blanket, lay Ranger, an 8-year-old German shepherd, whose once proud frame had thinned into something fragile. Like a warrior resting after a battle he should never have fought alone. Ranger had a strong, classic shepherd build when healthy. Tall, sturdy, deep chest, a coat of sable and charcoal black that gleamed bronze along the edges under sunlight. Now his fur was dull, clinging to his ribs with a sad looseness. His muzzle, once sharply alert, lay heavy on the seat. The rise and fall of his breathing came with uneven tremors. Ranger was not a typical K9. He had been a rescue before he ever learned commands. Found as a half-frozen pup during a blizzard on the eastern ridge, he had grown into a loyal, clever companion, known for his uncanny ability to track scent in storms that would send other units home. He was fiercely protective, but never aggressive. Stubborn, but gentle with children. Brave enough to shoulder danger, yet soft enough to sleep with his head on Elias's boots during long paperwork nights. But the dog in the back seat tonight did not resemble the legend of Crescent Valley's winter rescues. His paws twitched occasionally with a small, involuntary tremor, and every breath sounded like it came from deep inside some unseen struggle. For 48 hours, Elias had driven from one small clinic to another, first in Cedar Line, then in the mining town past the North Ridge. Both veterinarians there had good hearts but limited tools. Neither could find what was eating Ranger from within. They offered fluids, pain control, vague speculations. Nothing helped. Ranger's condition worsened so fast it was as if time itself had turned against him, which was why Elias was now braving an early winter storm, heading toward Northwind Animal Hospital, the only fully equipped veterinary center within 70 miles. The wipers beat a rhythmic struggle against the flurry of snowflakes that slapped the windshield like fragments of unwanted memory. A soft sound rose from the back. Not a whine, Ranger never complained. It was more like a whispered shift of breath. Elias glanced at the mirror and saw the dog's eyes flutter weakly, searching. "You're okay, buddy," he murmured, though his voice betrayed the strain of trying not to sound afraid. "We're almost there." Ranger's ear twitched. Then, Slowly, so slowly, that it hurt to watch. He lifted his head a few inches, stretched forward, and nudged the sleeve of Elias's winter jacket with the faintest touch of his nose. A gesture that years ago meant, let's go, but tonight meant something smaller, something fragile. Elias swallowed hard. It wasn't a goodbye, but it carried that ghostly shape. Not now, Elias told himself. Not tonight. As the SUV descended into the valley where Northwind Animal Hospital sat, a modern, steel and brick building standing bravely against the wind, snow thickened. Streetlights glowed like blurred lanterns behind veils of swirling white. The parking lot was nearly empty. It was late. Storms had a way of keeping people home. Elias parked, threw open the back door, and gathered Ranger into his arms. Even weakened, Ranger still weighed over 70 pounds, but Elias lifted him with the care of someone handling something sacred. Snow clung instantly to the man's dark jacket and to Ranger's coat, outlining their shapes in white like chalk on a blackboard. Inside the clinic's entrance hall, the warm air fogged the frost that clung to Elias's beard. The lobby lights were dimmed for the late hour, but a receptionist, a young man named Tyler, maybe 23, lanky with sandy blonde hair and the tired but earnest face of someone working their first winter night shifts, sprang up from his seat. Tyler was the sort of person who always seemed slightly out of breath, not because he ran, but because life moved faster than he was prepared for. Despite this nervous energy, he had a polite nature and a genuine love for animals, something evident in the way his eyes softened the instant he saw Ranger. "Oh man, is he let me get Dr. Shore?" Tyler hurried down the hallway, disappearing behind a set of swinging doors. The clinic, usually filled with chatter and clatter, in daylight, now felt like a cathedral of quiet urgency. Elias could hear his own heartbeat more clearly than the storm outside. Moments later, Dr. Marilyn Shore appeared. A woman in her mid-50s, she carried an aura of calm, forged from decades of emergencies. She had a tall, slender build and a posture that suggested quiet decisiveness rather than strictness. Her hair, long and silver gray, was tied into a low twist. Her eyes, sharp hazel with flecks of gold, had the perceptive focus of someone who had learned to read suffering in both animals and people. Marilyn's personality was a blend of two conflicting histories. In youth, she had been warm, easily overjoyed, the sort who volunteered at shelters in her free hours. But a personal loss during her early career, the sudden death of her first dog due to a misdiagnosis from an inexperienced vet, left a faint but permanent shadow in her character. Since then, Marilyn carried a quiet, unyielding determination to never let another animal slip through uncertainty. Her calmness wasn't gentleness, it was resolve. She approached Ranger with professional speed but emotional softness. "Officer Warner," she greeted with a nod. She recognized him from cases where injured strays were brought in after storms. "Let's get him in." As she examined Ranger on the steel table in the emergency room, she kept her movements deliberate. One hand adjusted the stethoscope. The other steadied Ranger's head. "He's dehydrated, febrile, weak. You did the right thing bringing him tonight. But I need to be honest, his condition is very serious." Elias's jaw tightened just subtly. He nodded, because nodding was the only thing keeping emotion from overflowing. "What do you need from me?" "Just stay close by. We're running blood tests, thoracic x-rays, and infection markers." Her voice softened. "Whatever is happening, we'll know soon." As machines whirred to life and sterile lights illuminated Ranger's fading strength, Elias placed a steady hand on the dog's neck. Ranger's breathing was thin, but when Elias's fingers grazed his fur, the shepherd's eyes opened just enough to find him. Ranger didn't lift his head again, but he shifted his chin closer to Elias's palm, as if anchoring himself to the one familiar thing left in the world. It was such a small motion, yet it made the room feel unbearably human. Minutes later, when the printer spat out the first sheets of test results, Marilyn leaned in, reading with intense focus. Her breath halted for half a second, just half, enough for Elias to notice. "It's not organ failure," she finally said, her expression a mixture of gravity and urgent hope. It's acute septic infection. Dangerous, but treatable if we act now. Elias exhaled, the sound half relief, half fear. So, there's a chance. Yes, Marilyn said. But we need to begin immediately. Outside, the storm thickened, snow spiraling like shards of white glass. But inside, Elias remained at Ranger's side, holding steady as the first battle of the long night began. Snow pressed against the tall glass windows of Northwind Animal Hospital, like a restless spirit trying to warn those inside. A pale wind swirled around the eaves of the building, scattering flecks of white against the floodlights that cast long shadows across the parking lot. It was not yet the fiercest part of the storm, but the valley was already wrapped in winter's unblinking stare. Inside the emergency wing, the air hummed with a different kind of tension, low, clinical, controlled. Machines emitted soft, rhythmic beeps. Overhead lights gleamed coldly against steel surfaces polished smooth by years of urgency. The scent of antiseptic and warm fur intermingled in a strange, almost sacred quiet. Night at Northwind was a fragile realm where every sound carried the weight of a heartbeat. Officer Elias Warner, having surrendered Ranger into the hands of professionals, stood near the far counter like a sentinel carved from worry. He was a man who rarely fidgeted. Steadiness was woven into the very grain of his bones. But tonight, his hand clenched and unclenched without rhythm. His dark winter jacket, still dusted with melting snow, had begun to leave a faint, damp circle on the floor. The cold had seeped into him deeper than winter usually could. Ranger lay on the treatment table beneath a focused beam of sterile white light. The dog's eyes were half closed, breaths shallow. Nurses moved around him with experienced efficiency, adjusting monitors, preparing syringes, inserting IV lines, each motion precise, purposeful. Ranger did not resist. He was too weak even for reflexes. Dr. Marilyn Shore stepped forward again, her expression composed but shadowed by calculation. She had already donned latex gloves and a thicker blue lab coat, the kind used during prolonged procedures. Her posture gave away nothing, not worry, not hope, not fear, but her eyes, sharp and thoughtful, followed every small change in Ranger's breathing. Marilyn was known in the crust region not just for her skill, but for an uncanny intuition, a kind of sixth sense for things other veterinarians had to puzzle over for hours. Locals joked that she could diagnose a dog just from the way it sighed, though she never found the joke amusing. Intuition, after all, came from experience, and experience often came from pain. She placed the cold metal of the stethoscope against Ranger's chest again, listening, her brows pressed slightly inward as the sound traveled through the instrument. The dog's heartbeat was elevated but strangely uneven, not enough to imply failure, but enough to suggest a hidden enemy. Tyler, the young receptionist who had turned into an assistant the moment he saw Ranger's condition, hovered nearby with a clipboard. "Blood work should be done in about 6 minutes," he said, voice wavering as though 6 minutes were an eternity. Marilyn nodded without lifting her gaze. "X-ray markers? Almost ready. They're warming the front. Plates? Good. Thank you." Tyler moved away, his long limbs awkwardly mirroring his concern. Elias watched him go, feeling a flicker of gratitude for the young man's earnestness. Kindness mattered on nights like this. Ranger shivered slightly, just enough for Elias to step closer instinctively. Marilyn paused. "He's responding to the cold," she said softly. "Not pain. We'll stabilize his temperature," she signaled to a nurse, who retrieved a thermal blanket and draped it gently across the dog's frail body. Ranger's breathing grew marginally steadier, though still too thin for comfort. When the machines finally completed their cycle, a small tray beside the printer rattled as pages slid out. Blood panels, infection markers, basic organ function data numbers that could either condemn or redeem. Marilyn lifted the sheet, eyes tracking down the columns with a focus so sharp it seemed to silence the room. A heartbeat, then another, then the faintest. Exhale from her lips, neither relief nor dread, just confirmation. "Not organ failure," she murmured, almost to herself. "That's good," Elias exhaled, tension momentarily loosening in his chest. though not enough to bring comfort. Marilyn continued scanning, her finger stopping at a specific set of values: white blood cell spikes, abnormal inflammatory markers, early signs of circulatory strain. It's acute septic infection, she concluded, turning the page so Elias could see the curved lines and shaded markers even if he didn't understand them. Sepsis. Aggressive. Dangerous. But treatable. That last word echoed softly, like a fragile but undeniable flame. Elias's throat tightened. Treatable, he repeated, grounding himself in the sound. Marilyn removed her gloves with a swift pull. We're going to start with broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately. Full fluid support, temperature regulation, respiratory monitoring. If we begin now, he has a fighting chance. Ranger stirred faintly, as if acknowledging the verdict. His ear twitched the smallest signal, but Elias saw it. Marilyn noticed too. That's good, she said. He's aware. But how did the other clinics miss this? Elias asked. Frustration barely edged behind his voice. They said dehydration, pain, maybe a bug. Nobody mentioned sepsis. Small clinics have limitations, Marilyn replied. Her tone was not defensive, only honest. Their labs are basic. Some infections hide beneath normal readings until they reach a critical stage. What they saw was only the surface. Surface, Elias echoed quietly. Think of it like ice on a lake, she said. Calm on top, turmoil underneath. Elias breathed out a sound that was almost a grim laugh. The metaphor felt far too personal for a man who had grown up on frozen mountain lakes. Marilyn stepped closer to Ranger's head and placed her hand gently beside his ear. He's a strong dog. I've seen his case files over the years. Storm rescues, canyon tracks, injuries he recovered from faster than any shepherd I've met. That kind of resilience matters tonight. Ranger shifted his eyes, eyelids heavy, gaze pulling toward the familiar silhouette standing just beyond the table. Elias leaned in, touching Ranger's neck again. I'm here, he whispered. We're not done. Not yet. Marilyn gave them a moment, a quiet bubble in the urgent flow of the hospital, before she signaled the nurses. Let's prepare the ICU. Start lines, prep antibiotics, warm the oxygen. The room snapped into motion. Stainless trays rattled gently. The hiss of oxygen filled the air. IV bags were hung, tubing clipped into ports, monitors calibrated. Ranger's heart rate beeped with steady insistence, a rhythm that felt both courageous and precarious. As the team worked, Tyler reappeared with a portable X-ray plate, moving with unusual coordination. Now that responsibility had replaced anxiety. He positioned it beneath Ranger's torso, stepping back with nervous anticipation. Marilyn took the image, held it up to the screen, and studied it. No fluid collapse, she said. Lungs are stressed, but not compromised. That helps us. We can focus on the circulatory system. Every piece of information seemed to sharpen Elias's breathing, both with fear and hope, a strange duality he had never liked, but had learned to live with as a police officer. When Ranger was ready for transfer, Marilyn looked at Elias with a sincerity so steady it felt like an anchor. The next 12 hours matter most, she said. He's weak, but not defeated. If he responds even slightly to the antibiotics, we'll have something solid to hold on to. Elias nodded. I'll be here. We have a family waiting area, she offered gently. I'm not leaving this hallway. Marilyn didn't argue. She gave a small nod of understanding, the kind given from one guardian to another, and supervised as the team moved Ranger into the ICU room, a space of soft lights and quiet machines. From the doorway, Elias watched as they settled the dog onto a padded mat, blankets tucked around him, sensors attached, fluids flowing. Ranger was still, but his eyes searched the room once more. When they found Elias, they held for several seconds. Not long, but long enough. A nurse closed the ICU door, leaving Elias in the pale glow of the hallway lights. Snow pressed harder against the windows now, covering the world outside in a thick shroud of white, as though winter itself were holding its breath. Elias sat down in one of the cold plastic chairs, elbows on knees, hands clasped together. He had endured injuries, blizzards, 2 near-fatal search missions, but never this particular ache. Waiting for someone he loved to fight a battle he could not see. Hours crept by the way, snowdrifts formed slowly, silently, layer after layer. Nurses walked past occasionally. Tyler brought him a paper cup of bitter coffee. Marilyn returned once, checking charts, then nodding at Elias with a quiet firmness. "Ranger is responding," she said simply. "Barely, but it's there. A thread of hope, fragile, but real." Outside, the storm continued building, but inside, something had shifted. The fight had begun, and Ranger, even in weakness, had not surrendered. The night pressed heavily against the windows of Northwind Animal Hospital, draping the world in a curtain of storm-gray darkness. Snow moved across the valley in relentless spirals, carried by winds that whistled against the rafters like the long breath of some ancient winter beast. Inside, the clinic felt like a fragile pocket of light, fighting to stay alive in the heart of a blizzard. In the dim hallway, Elias Warner sat hunched forward on a hard plastic chair, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped with an intensity that whitened the knuckles. It wasn't fatigue that bent his posture, it was helplessness, a feeling foreign to a man who had spent decades running toward danger, not waiting beside it. But sepsis was not a fugitive he could chase, nor a storm he could track, nor a broken road he could grit through. It was invisible, silent, hidden inside the bloodstream of the only companion who had never left his side. Fighting something you couldn't see, something you couldn't shoot, chase, or tackle, was a different kind of battle. It demanded nothing but patience, and patience was a cruel weapon tonight. Through the ICU window, the world shrank into soft gray light and cold metal. Ranger lay on a padded mat, wrapped in warming blankets that rose gently with every shallow breath. IV lines branched out from his foreleg like small tributaries, feeding hope into his tired body. Electrodes dotted his chest, the wires leading to a monitor that pulsed with thin, deliberate beeps. Each sound was a fragile reassurance that Ranger was still here. The staff worked around him in quiet patterns. A nurse, Holly, a woman in her early 30s with warm brown skin, rounded features, and a calm that came from raising 3 sons at home, adjusted the fluid drip. Holly had always radiated a steadiness that patients trusted instantly. She hummed under her breath while she worked, though the only ones who ever heard were the animals too sick to respond. Tonight, her humming was a delicate promise that she had not given up on Ranger. Every so often, Holly glanced toward Elias, offering a small nod, not cheerful, not dramatic, just a human reassurance that she understood what he was feeling. Dr. Marilyn Shore, meanwhile, looked like the embodiment of concentration. She stood at the end of the ICU bed, arms folded lightly, her tall frame steady as a statue, her eyes sharp, intelligent, tempered by the memory of her own past grief, moved from the monitors to Ranger, then back to the monitors again. Marilyn had always approached medicine like a strategist in a war room, choosing her moves carefully, never rushing, never panicking. Years ago, a mistake by someone else took her first dog from her too early. She had carried that memory like a vow in her spine. Tonight, that vow sharpened her focus. Inside the room, Ranger shifted, only slightly. The tremor traveled through his limbs in a wave so faint it might have been missed by an untrained eye. But Marilyn noticed. "He's responding slowly," she said, her voice audible through the half-open door. "Not enough improvement yet, but not worsening." Elias stood, stepping closer to the window. "Is that good?" "It keeps us in the fight," she replied. "That's what matters," Holly added. "Some dogs take hours to show any change on antibiotics. His body's weak. He's doing what he can." Elias nodded, and the nod carried more weight than simple agreement. He pressed a hand lightly against the glass, wishing he could cross that invisible barrier, wishing he could touch Ranger like before. He had been allowed inside earlier, during the setup of the lines, but ICU protocol now required distance. The restriction made sense. It didn't make it easier. Behind the glass, Ranger's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy around the edges, dimmed by exhaustion and fever, but they locked onto Elias through the window. The connection lasted only A heartbeat, maybe two, but those seconds were enough to loosen something tight and aching in Elias's chest. "I'm right here," he whispered, though Ranger couldn't hear him. Time crawled. The storm outside thickened. Snow pressed harder against the windows, turning the world into a swirling, isolated landscape. Machines beeped in rhythm, marking the passing of minutes like cold, mechanical heartbeats. It wasn't long before fatigue began to weigh down Elias's shoulders. He didn't sleep, but he drifted somewhere between vigilance and exhaustion until footsteps approached. Marilyn walked out of the ICU and stood beside him. Her expression was professional, but softened by something almost protective. "It's near midnight," she said. "We won't know much more for a few hours." "I'll stay," Elias answered automatically. "I assumed you would." She offered the faintest smile. "Go stretch your legs. Drink something warm. Come back in 10 minutes. Ranger won't be alone. If I step away, he won't slip away in 10 minutes, she said gently. "His vitals are stable enough for now." Elias hesitated, but Marilyn's steady gaze pushed him to move. He walked down the hall to the vending machine, purchased a cup of coffee that tasted like melted cardboard, and returned almost instantly, refusing to stay gone any longer than necessary. When he returned to the ICU window, something had changed. Ranger's breathing had settled, not dramatically, but enough to create a subtle difference in the rise and fall of the blankets. His chest expanded with slightly more rhythm, a little less uneven strain. The monitor reflected tiny improvements, marginal increases in oxygen saturation, and decreased heart rate spikes. Holly looked up from adjusting the fluid pump and said, "He's responding. Slowly, but he is." Elias released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's good, right? It's enough to give us real hope," she said. "Not false hope. Real hope." Marilyn reappeared behind Holly, observing the same metrics. "He's not out of danger. But the antibiotics are beginning to work. His immune system's weak, but it's trying." Elias leaned closer to the glass, eyes fixed on Ranger. "You keep fighting, okay? You never quit on me. I'm not quitting on you." Inside, Ranger did something he hadn't done all night. He shifted his weight. Not much, just a small movement of his forepaw. His nails clicked softly against the mat. Then he lifted his head half an inch before letting it fall again. For anyone else, it might have looked like an involuntary twitch, but Elias knew the dog like he knew his own heartbeat. Ranger wasn't twitching. He was trying. "Good boy," Elias whispered. The night deepened. The minutes crawled forward like icy drifts across a frozen ridge. But the tide, once invisible, had shifted. Ranger was responding. He was weak, but he was fighting. By 2 a.m, his vitals had stabilized enough that Marilyn gave Elias a moment inside the room. Only a moment. Protocol was strict, but enough for something human to happen. Elias approached the mat slowly, crouching beside Ranger, with a tenderness that did not match his rugged build. He touched the dog's head carefully, running his fingers between the rough patches of fur. Ranger's eyes opened again. This time, they stayed open longer. His breathing hitched, then steadied, and he nudged his nose ever so slightly toward Elias's hand. "You're doing better," Elias murmured. "Just keep going." Marilyn watched from the doorway, arms folded loosely. Holly stood beside her, smiling just a little. Neither interrupted. Elias remained for only 30 seconds. It was all the rules allowed, but when he stepped back outside the ICU room, something in him felt stronger, more anchored. The night was still long. The danger was still real. The outcome was still uncertain. But for the first time since the ordeal began, Elias didn't feel like they were losing. Ranger had answered the fight, and that was enough for tonight. Dawn arrived the way shy miracles do, quietly, hesitantly, as though unsure whether the night had truly passed. Outside Northwind Animal Hospital, the sky remained wrapped in layers of pewter gray clouds, but somewhere behind them, a muted light pressed gently on the darkness, thinning it little by little. The storm had not stopped, but it had softened into a lazy drift, as though winter itself were too tired to rage. Inside the hospital, the nightlights dimmed automatically, yielding to the slow bloom of morning luminescence overhead. Machines continued their low, steady hum. Monitors flickered softly, and the faint warmth of the building's heating system fought against the relentless cold that seeped through every corner. Elias Warner, who had refused to sleep more than a handful of minutes at a time, straightened from the chair where he had spent the night. His back protested the movement, vertebrae stiff from hours of tension. His eyes were red-rimmed, the fatigue carving shadows beneath them, but his focus, his purpose, remained sharp. He approached the ICU window again, palms pressing lightly against the glass. Ranger lay exactly where he had left him, hours earlier, wrapped in warming blankets, connected to monitors and IV lines. But something felt different, not visibly dramatic, something subtle, like the feeling of stepping into a room that has recently exhaled. Movement inside caught his eye. "Doctor." Marilyn Shore entered the ICU, coat folded neatly over her arm, stethoscope hanging from her neck. She looked even more composed than she had last night, her hair gathered into a clean twist, her posture tall and unwavering. She moved toward Ranger with the deliberate steps of someone approaching a fragile truth, ready to see it, ready to hold it steady. A nurse, Holly, whose soft humming had faded only when exhaustion finally touched her, followed behind with a new IV bag and a fresh set of readings printed on a clipboard. Marilyn leaned over Ranger and listened to his chest. For a few seconds, nothing seemed to change. Then, her shoulders eased just slightly, barely noticeable unless one had been watching her, the way Elias had all night. Elias stepped closer to the door. "Is he?" Marilyn looked up at him, her expression calm but brighter than before. "You should come inside," she said. The door clicked open, and Elias stepped into the ICU. The room was warm, not just with temperature regulation, but with the fragile warmth of possibility. Ranger stirred. His breathing, though still shallow, had lost the ragged edge it carried through the night. His rib cage rose and fell with more rhythm. And then his eyes opened, slowly, heavily, like clouds parting after a long storm. They were faintly glossy from fever, but they held recognition. They held presence. "Morning," Elias whispered, voice nearly breaking. Ranger blinked. A soft thump sounded beneath the blanket. Not a full wag, not even a half wag, just the slightest nudge of a tail, a movement so small it could have been overlooked as a twitch. But to Elias, it was as loud as thunder. He reached down and stroked Ranger's head. "You stubborn old hero, you're still fighting." Marilyn watched them with a soft, almost invisible smile, one that revealed the side of her rarely seen by strangers. "This is good," she said. "Really good. His breathing is more regulated. Heart rate shows less oscillation. He's responding to the antibiotics." Elias exhaled shakily. "So he's improving?" "Yes," she replied. "It's early, and there's a long road ahead, but the fact that he's present, that he can open his eyes, those are signs we needed." Holly approached with the new IV bag. "He's still weak, but he's doing better than we expected at this stage." As she worked, she spoke in her warm, slightly teasing tone. "You just wanted to scare us, didn't you, boy?" And Ranger's ear twitched faintly in response. Elias, sitting beside the mat, brushed his fingers along Ranger's muzzle. The dog leaned a millimeter into his hand. Not much, but voluntary. Voluntary meant alive. Voluntary meant hope. The storm outside grew brighter, with morning clouds lifting enough to let pale rays of sunlight seep through. They illuminated the frost around the windows, turning snowflakes into fleeting sparks before they melted. For the first time in days, Crescent Valley felt like it might remember warmth. Marilyn checked the monitors again. "He's still fragile. His body has been through a great deal. But this is a turning point." Elias nodded, unable to speak. His throat felt tight, as though every emotion he had been holding since Ranger first fell sick had suddenly gathered into a single knot. "Can I stay here?" he asked. Marilyn answered without hesitation. "Yes, but keep your movements slow. He needs calm." Calm was not something Elias had much experience with, but he would borrow calm from the dog, who had taught him courage in winter storms, from the nurses who hummed faith into their work, from Marilyn's steady hands. Hours passed in slow, quiet increments. Ranger drifted in and out of sleep, But every time he woke, he searched for Elias. The officer stayed close, leaning forward with an attentiveness that blotted out the rest of the world. At one point, Ranger shifted slightly under the blankets. Elias froze not out of fear, but out of breathless hope. Then Ranger pressed his head weakly toward Elias's knee. It wasn't a strong movement. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. Ranger was reaching for him. Elias lowered his hand gently. "I'm here," he said again. "I'm staying." The dog's breathing steadied, as if the reassurance had threaded warmth through him. Marilyn stepped outside for a moment to brief the day staff. Holly replaced her hum with soft conversation about the weather and how her youngest son claimed snowstorms were the sky having feelings. Elias chuckled faintly, a rare sound, but one that carried relief. As morning continued to unfold, Ranger's eyes remained open more frequently. He no longer struggled for each breath. The jagged cadence of the night had softened into something closer to harmony. When Marilyn returned, she updated Elias with measured optimism. "We'll keep monitoring him closely," she said. "The next 24 hours matter. But if he continues like this, we'll have passed the most dangerous stage." Elias bowed his head with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Marilyn shook her head. "Thank Ranger. He's the one choosing to stay." Elias looked down at the dog who had survived storms, avalanches, cliff rescues, and now an invisible war against his own bloodstream. Ranger's gaze met his once more, tired but steady. "You hold on," Elias whispered. "We're not done with our winters yet." Outside, the morning brightened. The storm thinned into gentle flakes, drifting lazily across a pale sky. Inside, Ranger rested, but for the first time in days, he rested with strength gathering, not fading. The dawn that shouldn't have come had found its way through the snow. By the time 2 more days passed, winter had decided to bare its teeth again. Crescent Valley, already frozen into a landscape of brittle branches and buried rooftops, now vanished beneath a blizzard so thick it looked as though the sky itself had shattered into white fragments. Wind roared against the walls of Northwind Animal Hospital, shaking the gutters and sending vibrations through the steel beams. Snow piled against the doors, rising inch by inch, like a cold tide with no intention of retreating. Inside, however, the world felt different, warm, quiet, suspended somewhere between fear and hope. In the ICU room, the lights glowed soft and golden, reflecting off the equipment that encircled Ranger like silent guardians. His breaths came steadier now, still shallow, but carrying rhythm instead of struggle. His body remained thin, weak, the once bold muscles softened by days of illness. But his eyes, they no longer drifted unfocused through fever. They moved with intention, seeking familiar things: the doorway, the nurses, the shadows, and most of all, Elias Warner, who had hardly left the room except when forced. Elias stood beside Ranger's mat, one hand resting gently against the dog's neck. His posture was still tense, years of policing and the long nights of worry carved into his stance, but there was a new softness to his features. The deep creases across his brow had lightened. The hard line of his jaw had eased. Only the exhaustion under his eyes remained untouched. Holly, the nurse with warm features and the patience of someone who'd raised 3 sons, adjusted the heating setting. "Storm's hitting the town pretty bad," she said conversationally. "Road closures everywhere. Feels like the valley just decided to turn into a snow globe." Elias barely responded, too focused on Ranger. But Holly didn't mind. She had spent enough nights caring for sick animals to understand that grief and hope often left people half here, half somewhere else entirely. As Holly checked Ranger's foreline, Dr. Marilyn Shore entered the room. She was dressed in a thicker charcoal gray coat today, her tall frame carrying an air of authority sharpened by the storm. There was frost in her hair from the walk between the staff entrance and the ICU ward, tiny white specks melting as she stepped into the warm room. "How is he?" she asked Holly. "Stable so far. Better, actually." Marilyn turned to the monitors, scanning each number with the focus of someone hunting for threats invisible to the untrained eye. After a moment, she nodded. "Good. Very good." Elias exhaled softly, but his attention never left Ranger. Then, something unexpected happened. It began with the slightest tightening of Ranger's shoulder muscles, barely noticeable beneath the blanket. Then a faint tremor ran down his spine, too controlled to be involuntary, too intentional to ignore. Ranger shifted. Not a twitch, not a spasm, a deliberate movement. Marilyn stepped closer. "Easy, boy," she murmured. With a slow, shaky effort, Ranger began to turn his body. His paws slid across the soft mat, claws scraping lightly against the edge. His legs trembled, so weak, so thin, but they moved. He was trying to stand. "Hold on," Elias whispered, his voice filled with both fear and awe. He dropped to his knees beside the dog. "Take it slow, buddy. Slow." Ranger pushed again, his muscles trembling as if every ounce of strength was being squeezed from a well that had nearly dried. His hind legs tried to gain traction, but slipped. Elias steadied him gently, supporting his torso without lifting him fully, letting Ranger use what strength he had instead of carrying him. Marilyn watched with cautious hope. If he's trying, it means he's regaining muscle control. That's a very promising sign. The wind howled outside the window, sending branches tapping sharply against the pane. Inside, another time. Sound rose, soft but unmistakable. The faint groan of Ranger's joints as he pushed harder. He lifted his chest from the mat, shakily, weakly, but unmistakably alive. Elias placed a hand beneath Ranger's shoulder blades. "You've got this," he whispered, voice thick. "One step at a time." Ranger wobbled, his legs trembling like young saplings in a storm. He planted one forepaw down, then the other. His hind legs followed, uncertain but determined. He stood. It was not heroic. It was not graceful. It was not strong, but it was victory. Holly's hand flew to her mouth, eyes shining. "Oh my gosh, look at him." Marilyn allowed herself something rare, a real smile, wide and warm. "Well done, Ranger," she said softly. Ranger took a breath, his ears flicking weakly. Then, with the instinct of a dog who had never known surrender, he tried to take a step. Elias steadied him again. "Easy, easy. One moment at a time." Ranger stepped, a small step, a wobbling, clumsy, half-inch shuffle. But a step. Elias felt something break inside him, something that had been locked tight for days. Relief poured in, sharp and overwhelming. He blinked rapidly, swallowing back a wave of emotion. "That's it," he whispered. "That's my boy." Marilyn's voice softened. "If he's walking even a little, that means his strength is returning. He truly is winning." Outside, the blizzard raged with renewed force, the world disappearing behind sheets of white. But inside, a different storm was breaking. A storm of fear, of helplessness, of days spent teetering on the edge of loss. Ranger, trembling, finally lowered himself back down onto the mat. Elias steadied him carefully as the dog rested his head on the blanket. His breaths came faster from the exertion, but not dangerously so. "That was more than enough for now," Marilyn said. "He'll be exhausted. Let him rest." Elias nodded, brushing his hand along Ranger's muzzle. The German shepherd closed his eyes, leaning into the touch with unmistakable trust. Hours passed. The storm outside shook the roof. Lights flickered once, then steadied. Holly brought Elias a fresh coffee, the kind only hospitals knew how to make, tasting faintly burnt but comforting in its own way. Marilyn checked Ranger's vitals every hour, her expression a mixture of caution and quiet pride. As evening settled, Elias finally allowed himself to sit back in the chair. Exhaustion tugged at him, dragging him toward sleep. He fought it as long as he could, but mid-sentence, mid-whisper to Ranger, his eyes slipped shut. It was only a few minutes of rest. But during those minutes, something unexpected happened. Ranger, still weak, still trembling, lifted his paw, slowly, unsteadily. He placed it on Elias's knee. Not desperation, not instinct, not a final gesture. A beginning, a sign of return, not goodbye. When Elias startled awake moments later, his breath caught at the sight. He reached out and cupped Ranger's paw gently. "You're coming back," he murmured. Outside, the snowstorm finally began to fade, its fury spent. Inside, a different kind of storm eased too. Ranger had fought, and Ranger had won the day. The storm that had battered Crescent Valley through the night finally exhausted itself by morning. Snow no longer hurled angrily across the windows but drifted down in soft, lazy flakes, gentle and unhurried, like feathers shaken loose from a sleeping sky. The blanket of white outside lay smooth and untouched, turning the world into a quiet canvas waiting for footsteps. Inside Northwind Animal Hospital, the warmth felt deeper than the building's heaters could explain. It was the sort of warmth that came after a long fight, subtle but unmistakable. A warmth made of relief, of gratitude, of the strange, silent joy that follows a night no one was certain they would survive. Elias Warner walked through the hallway toward the ICU room with steps that felt different than they had the day before, lighter, less burdened, hopeful but cautiously so, the way a man who had lost before approached good news with reverence. When he reached Ranger's room, he paused at the doorway. Inside, the German shepherd lifted his head at the sound of approaching footsteps. His eyes, still rimmed with exhaustion but now brightened by something undeniably alive, found Elias instantly. The dog's ears twitched, and though his body was still frail, he shifted with clear intention. "Morning, buddy," Elias whispered, crossing the room. Ranger's tail moved again. A small swish, a deliberate one. Dr. Marilyn Shore stood at the foot of the mat, reviewing readings on the monitor. She wore a fresh lab coat, her silver-gray hair tied neatly away from her face, and her expression, usually composed into something unreadable, held a gentleness that few people ever saw. "He's ready," she said. Elias's breath hitched. "Ready?" Marilyn nodded. "He's strong enough to leave the ICU, and with the way he's responded to treatment," she glanced down at Ranger, "I believe he's ready to go home." The words did not come with dramatic music or applause, but they struck Elias harder than any sound ever could. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Ranger took a breath, then shifted his paws, as though demonstrating agreement. Even his weakness could not hide the intent in the movement. "But remember," Marilyn added, her voice gentle and firm, "he'll still need time. His strength will return gradually. No long walks yet. Plenty of water, medication as directed, and rest. A lot of rest." Elias nodded. "I'll do whatever he needs." "I know you will," she said, smiling softly. Holly entered with a clipboard and a small bag containing medication bottles, discharge instructions, and a neatly folded set of gauze. "And don't worry," she added. "I put everything in plain English, no doctor language riddles." Elias managed a tired but grateful chuckle. "Thank you." Ranger attempted to rise, legs trembling slightly. Elias knelt beside him, providing gentle support without lifting him outright. "Slow," he whispered. "No rush." The shepherd leaned against him, gathering strength, pushing through the remnants of weakness that still clung to his limbs. After a moment, he stood wobbly, thin, but proud in a quiet, defiant way. Elias felt a sting behind his eyelids. Marilyn watched them with her arms folded, but her expression warm. "He wants to walk out of here on his own." Holly dabbed at the corner of her eye with her sleeve. "I told you he was stubborn." Stubborn was an understatement. Ranger was a storm survivor, a canyon tracker, a dog who had once pulled a lost child out of 3 feet of snow. Illness had dimmed him, but it had not erased the fire inside him. Elias clipped on the leash the nurse handed him, his hands shaking, not from cold, but from emotion. The leash felt different today, not like a tether, not like a lifeline, but like a promise. Ranger took a step, then another. His movement, though weak, held focus, determination, hope. Elias walked slowly beside him, matching the dog's hesitant pace. Marilyn parted the ICU door, and they stepped into the hallway, 2 figures, walking out of a place that had almost become their final chapter. As they passed the reception area, people looked up. A woman waiting with her elderly cat paused, tears welling in her eyes. A man holding a beagle pup whispered something soft to his child. Tyler, the young receptionist, froze halfway through typing a form. His mouth opened, then curved into a smile so wide it nearly split his face. No applause, no cheers, just warmth. Warmth that filled the small space like sunlight breaking into a shadowed room. At the door, Elias paused to look down at Ranger. Snowlight streamed in through the glass, illuminating the dog's fur, no longer dull, but reflecting faint hints of bronze, where strength had begun to return. "You ready?" he asked quietly. Ranger moved closer to him, brushing his head against Elias's thigh. "Yes, home." Elias opened the door. Cold air rushed in, but it was not the biting, merciless winter that had swallowed them days ago. It was a softer cold, tinged with morning and the promise of renewal. Snow glistened across the parking lot, untouched and clean. The sky above them was opening still gray, still winter, but with streaks of pale light threading through the clouds. Ranger stepped forward, paws sinking gently into the fresh snow. He lifted his head, drawing in the crisp air with a long, fragile breath. Elias knelt beside him, wrapping an arm around the dog's shoulders, pulling him close. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. Ranger leaned into him, weak but warm, fragile but alive. Marilyn watched from the doorway, arms crossed loosely, a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. Holly stood beside her, both women unified in a silent understanding. They had watched countless animals arrive sick, wounded, fading, but it was rare to witness a return, so complete, so deserved, so deeply fought for. Elias pressed his forehead gently to Ranger's. "You're the bravest soul I've ever known." Ranger exhaled softly, eyes half closing, a tiny spark of contentment flickering behind them. He shifted slightly, brushing his snout against Elias's coat, as if reminding him, "We came through this together." The snow brightened again, sunlight piercing through the thinning clouds, turning the valley white with gentle radiance. And so the two of them, a man and his dog, both worn, both changed, both returned to one another, began the slow walk to the waiting SUV. There was no hurry, no urgency, only gratitude, only breath. Only the quiet miracle that winter had given back what it nearly stole. Not victors of a grand battle, not heroes on a stage, but companions restored. Two souls who had survived the storm and were heading home. This story reminds us that God's miracles do not always arrive in flashes of light or mighty signs. Sometimes they come quietly through the loyalty of a dog who refuses to give up, through the strength God places in an exhausted officer, or through the moments when hope rises, just as the night feels longest. In our everyday lives, we face storms too, days when we feel tired, uncertain, or alone. But God walks beside us even then. He guides our steps, protects our families, and sends help in ways we often recognize only afterward. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and remember to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength wherever you are watching from. And if you believe in the gentle miracles He sends, type Amen in the comments.